Let me just get started by motivating what I want to talk about, which is what are the biggest internal challenges facing your company in China? So every year, CEIBS administers a survey to hundreds of executives, both in Chinese companies and foreign-owned companies in China. And the number one and number two answers consistently every year, pretty much, is innovation capability and finding and retaining talent. And so you can be sure that the talent that they have a challenge finding are those related to innovation. And this is probably no surprise to those of you who are working in some R&D related area. And just to give you another example of the importance of R&D, this question asks, what are your plans for the next 3 years? And you can see that almost every company has indicated they're either going to expand their R&D activities or at least keep them the same, right? Almost no company is going to reduce their R&D activities. So this is clearly of importance to nearly every company, at least according to the survey. How have Chinese companies managed to quickly ramp up their R&D capabilities? What is one of the quick ways to get that innovation knowledge that you lack, to get the talents, the engineers, the scientists, or managers with understanding of how to motivate people to generate quality R&D? How do you quickly get that capacity? Anybody know? What do Chinese companies usually do? Acquisition, that's exactly right. And where do they go to acquire these companies? Yes, exactly. And any country in particular stand out to you? Yes, Europe and US. Wow, I feel like you've seen my figures already, my next slide. So that's right. So they have really gone in a big way to Europe and the US, just as you said. And as you can see, this is up to 2015. So the reason why it doesn't go beyond 2015 is because the US especially, but also to some extent Europe and EU countries, began imposing restrictions on allowing acquisitions. So this was traditionally the way that Chinese companies would get that innovation capability, right? They've had to find alternative ways now. But this is a challenge. I mean, this is why now this is a very big goal for the government and why they're devoting so much money to help spur innovation, right? This is one of the big reasons. And another challenge associated with acquiring a foreign company is that those acquisitions typically fail. So according to research based on M&As of American companies, right, 2 American companies merge, about 70 to 90% fail within 3 to 5 years typically. And that's 2 companies in the same country. Right? So the culture is probably not too different. Just imagine how difficult it is to merge 2 companies from very different cultural contexts, like China and the US, or China and Europe. Okay, very tough to make a long-lasting success. So, how can you improve the likelihood that an innovation-related acquisition will add value? That's the first question. But second, and perhaps more important right now, is how can China improve its domestic innovation environment to support innovation because of these restrictions on cross-border M&As? But even more so, how can you take advantage of it? How can you recognize the right way to invest in innovation to amplify your company's R&D capabilities? The thing you want to avoid is spending millions of dollars on the wrong type of R&D. And this is not just a mistake that companies make. This is a mistake that governments make. And there, we're talking about billions of lost dollars, not just millions. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to talk specifically about this. All right, so before I get into that, I'm just going to give a little bit of more detail about who I am. So I'll just quickly mention that I'm not Chinese, in case you couldn't tell. I'm I'm from Canada originally, and I like to emphasize that because I also have American citizenship. So until after the election, I like to tell people I'm Canadian. So it makes my life a little bit tough because being Canadian is not that much better than American, but at least it's not quite as bad. And I've had the opportunity to work in a number of different places. So you can see, as James mentioned, I've lived and worked in Italy and Singapore and Australia. And I've also worked for a government official in the US. So I have some insight into sort of what's happening in the US right now, just because of my experience there. And I've altogether lived in about 8 countries on 4 continents. But I met my wife in Singapore. And I used to tell people, especially foreigners who are not familiar with China, that she's from a tiny town you've probably never heard of, only about 10 million people, called Wuhan. And unfortunately, I can't say you've never heard of Wuhan, because now everybody has heard of Wuhan, of course. But I was just there actually about 6 weeks ago. And it was kind of amusing because they would see me, and of course they were, had this very, traumatic experience. And of course, at that time, and right now as well, the US is experiencing a surge in COVID cases. And so we went and, I introduced myself, and I was with my wife. And the person to whom I introduced myself, once I told them that I'm American, he looked at me like I'm a vampire. Anyway, we didn't have any problems, and luckily my wife and her friends and family, direct friends and family, also didn't have any negative experiences. But if you or your family members did, I'm so sorry for the difficulties that you've faced, because I've heard some very, difficult stories from people through my wife and her family and friends. And if any of you work in the medical profession, or your family members or friends do, I'm so grateful for the tremendous sacrifice that they have made. But let me just go back and just explain what I want to talk about today is to tell you a little bit about my research. And part of the reason, what I want to do is just explain that, as I said, my life at home is a little bit difficult. So not just because I'm American, but also because I live with my mother-in-law. Any of you live with your mother-in-law? Nobody wants to admit it anyway. It's tough. And so, in fact, there's this hierarchy in my house, and I don't know if James has the same experience, where his 2-year-old daughter is at the top of his family, the hierarchy of his home. And then, at least in my house, my mother-in-law is next. And then my wife. And then my friend actually has a turtle. And he left like the day before COVID-19 struck, and he gave me the turtle to take care of. And he thought it would be a couple weeks, and it's turned into like 9 months now. And unfortunately, that turtle gets priority over me. So then there's the turtle, and then there's me. I'm at the bottom, underneath the turtle, unfortunately. So the reason I say this is because I want to boost my ego for a moment. Forgive me. I'm going to brag a little bit about my research accomplishments, but also it's a way to sort of establish my credibility for you, so you believe what I'm going to tell you is accepted. So I'll just highlight some of my recent research. So I have a book that came out not long ago, a couple years ago, and it was the winner of this big book award. And it was, I got a prize of 1 million yen. So Sounds really good, 1 million. And then I say yen, and well, it's okay, I guess. So it's about 10,000 US dollars. But it was the first time that the prize was awarded to a business school professor since the prize started in 1985, which is kind of a big deal. And it's named after a former prime minister of Japan. So it's it's kind of a nice thing. And a couple papers were recognized that used the framework of that book and applied it to corporate social responsibility, for example. And then the thing that I really want to highlight, because it's the topic of the talk today, is this article that I published in the Straits Times. Anybody know where the Straits Times is published? Singapore. Are you guys from Singapore? Anybody from Singapore? You're from Singapore. Okay, so you might hate what I'm going to say today. I hope not. I hope you'll find it interesting. So I published this piece in the Straits Times on April 30th, 2008. And the day it was published, I got a call from the personal private secretary of Lee Kuan Yew. Or actually, my dean did, the dean of my school. And you know Lee Kuan Yew, of course, he is the founding father of Singapore, and he has since passed away. And he was the reason for Singapore's amazing development. But one of the challenges that Singapore faced as it became more developed at a higher level of income is how to spur innovation, right? Those of you who know Singapore well know that this is one of the big challenges that they faced. And so the conventional explanation is about culture. It's about, Singapore has a lot of rules, and the traditional explanation is that because there's so many rules, it stifled creativity. And this dampened innovation. Okay. Well, we came up, I published this piece with my student. We published an alternative explanation. It's not about culture at all. I'm going to share that explanation with you today. And I'm going to explain how it applies to China and to Chinese companies. But what happened after I got this call, or my dean got the call from Lee Kuan Yew's office to ask for my CV, I was invited to speak to a couple people in government, and I was informed that there was a meeting among government ministers to discuss the implications of the argument we made for government policy on innovation in Singapore. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting real-world, impact that sometimes, very rarely, academics have. But I'm hoping that you'll see the practical relevance of what I'm going to talk about here today. Okay, so let's get started. So you can think about innovation as coming in one of two basic types: radical innovation, or maybe disruptive innovation, and incremental innovation. Can somebody give me an example of radical or disruptive innovation? You all know what this is. Somebody just give me a quick example, please. Internet coming in play. What did it displace? Okay, it changed everything. Yeah, it's hard to say what exactly the internet changed because there's so many things that it impacted, sure. Okay, one common example is the smartphone. And this is not as dramatic, of course, as the internet. That's a better example. But the smartphone in relation to the old, Nokia phones, just as an example. Another example is automobiles displacing the horse and buggy. Okay, and then the other type of innovation is this incremental form, which is referring to the change from one model of iPhone to the next, right? Each model gets a little bit better than the previous one, right? Same with automobiles. So that's like incremental innovation. Okay, what's important to note is that some countries display a greater capacity at producing radical or disruptive types of innovation better than others, like the United States. And some countries are better at incremental innovations, like Germany and Japan. Why? Why do they display this difference? Now, in the US, incremental innovations do occur. And in Germany and Japan, radical or disruptive innovations also occur. But there's a tendency towards one type of innovation than compared to the other type in each of those countries. And the question is why? And if you understand why, then you can use that knowledge to help amplify your own company's innovation capabilities. And you can better decide which type of company to acquire. Okay. So there are two important determinants of innovation outcomes. One is the market institutions that determine whether radical or incremental types of innovation are more likely. And the second is the funding sources. So given that you have your market institutions privilege radical innovations, in which industries are those radical innovations most likely to occur? And same for incremental. Okay, I want to focus on this market institutions part first. Okay, so market institutions we can think of as coming in two basic types. And we can classify them as coordinated market economies and liberal market economies. Coordinated market economies refer to economies where actors in the economy, like firms and workers or labor and capital, banks, for example, they coordinate with each other. That is, they form relationships. And those relationships persist over a long period of time, typically, right? And they form the basis on which business progresses in that economy. In liberal market economies, it's not about relationships so much. It's much more transaction-based. It's about the price, deciding who you are going to work with. Right? How does the market itself determine the price? And based on the price, you then buy somebody's goods or you negotiate a contract with this particular firm versus the other firm. But it's and when you go to raise money, it's what's the price at which you sell your bonds, or what's the price of the stock of a company that you want to purchase. Right? It's not so much about relationships with you and a bank. Okay, so these are the basic two types of economies. We can classify among these advanced economies into these two basic types. And they are made up of 5 types of market institutions when we think of the coordinated and liberal types. So these are the 5, and I'm going to focus on corporate ownership and employee relations primarily. And I'll also just show you a little bit about intercompany relations. And I'll show you how it extends to these other 2 dimensions, these other 2 market institutions as well. But the structure of these market institutions, these 5 dimensions, tell you whether a country is more coordinated or liberal, and in turn, the type of innovation that it's going to generate. Okay? If you have any questions, just raise your hand, please. All right. So, corporate ownership. In Germany, what kind of corporate ownership is more common? Who are the types of owners of German companies typically? Is it hundreds or thousands of small shareholders? Or is it usually a family or other companies? So can you tell us? That's right, yeah, so family business is much more common in Germany. Yeah. They tend to also, government sometimes is an important block owner. Labor unions also sometimes own large blocks of shares. But the point is that CEOs are accountable to those dominant owners of a company. the family owner typically, right? And so they are constrained in their freedom to pursue different types of corporate actions. Okay, what about liberal market economies like the United States? Who are the big owners in that place, in the United States? Is it families so much? Sorry? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Mutual funds, yeah. So if you're in the back especially, you can just, I think anywhere, so everybody can hear you, just press the microphone button and we'll be able to, everybody can hear what you'll say. Yeah, mutual funds, right. And if not, mutual funds are in essence acting on behalf of small individual investors. And sometimes the individual investors themselves directly own shares. But the point is that it's about diffuse ownership, where you have hundreds, if not thousands, of small investors, small shareholders. And the implication of this is that CEOs then have a lot more decision-making power because they're not closely monitored by one owner. And this allows, and the way to compensate for this freedom is to force CEOs to give updates about company performance every 3 months. And that makes them very focused on the short-term performance of their companies. Whereas German companies, because they're owned by a family, those managers are thinking, how do I ensure the success of this company over the long term? And the family owner is thinking, how do I make sure the company remains stable so I can pass it on to my children? They're thinking long term. And you see this in the types of ownership that are most prevalent in these two economies. And what about employee relations? In Germany, how do employees typically voice their views? That's right, labor unions. Thank you. Labor unions are very important to how employees voice their opinion in the context of German companies. They're much more powerful in Germany than in the United States. And they represent employees to negotiate with regard to wages and employment conditions, right? And the length of their contract, for example, whether there's a layoff or not. And the consequence of this is that long-term employment is more common in Germany because workers have strong representation in the form of these labor unions to protect them. In the US, labor unions are weak. Wages are set by the market, and workers have relatively little influence on whether layoffs are being implemented by the CEO. In fact, you probably hear all the time, CEOs in US companies will lay off employees as the first measure when a downturn happens, right? Cut costs, lay off employees. Okay, that's typical of American companies. And as a consequence, short-term employment is more common in US companies. Okay, so those are just a couple examples, and this is some data just to back up what I'm saying. But if any of you have worked for a German company, I think you'll agree with the characterization that I've made, right? If you've worked for an American company, you probably also will agree with, in general, the characterization that I've made. Okay, and I just want to highlight one other dimension, this intercompany relations. So in German or European or Japanese companies, typically companies are interconnected through associations. And through these associations, these networks, they collectively share in the costs of doing research and development, or education and training costs for their employees, and they will engage in wage and employment bargaining together with the labor union, right? And as a consequence, you have a high level of coordination among firms, right? And this is going back to the title, they're called coordinated market economies, very much because of this intercompany relationship. Liberal market economies, the firms typically only collaborate on individual projects, right? And they certainly don't negotiate together with regard to the setting of wages for their workers, right? That never happens. And as a consequence, there's a low level of coordination among companies in the US. Okay, so I'm sort of going into the details of each of these market institutions, but I'm building up to understanding why innovation differs in these two places as a result of this. And just to show you how this is manifested, these intercompany relations, here are interlocking directorates among firms in the UK. So this is the UK, and each number on the Y and X axis represents a company, right? And the ones in the box are the number of directors on the board that are a director of two companies, right? So this individual is a director of company 1, Barclays Bank, and 2, the BP company. Okay, so this is the UK, this is Britain, this is Germany. Okay, so you can see there's a lot more dense interconnections just according to this one measure. Okay. So if we look at how these characteristics are manifested across the 5 dimensions. So ownership in Germany is concentrated, especially among families. In the US, it's diffuse. It's hundreds, if not thousands, of small shareholders. Right? In Germany, you have stable employment and strong unions. The financial system tends to rely more heavily on banks. Right? Relationships are important for getting the money you need to grow your business. Education and training also tends to be much more based on specialized skills and training. Right? Vocational training is important. Apprenticeships are very important to the German industry. Right? They're almost non-existent in the United States. And then finally, coordination among companies and actors in the economy is very important to Germany. So you have these 2 types, basically. You have this German coordinated type here, and the liberal US type over here. And what does this mean? Well, basically, it means Germany and its market institutions are encouraging long-term coordination between labor and capital and companies. Right? In the US, it's short-term. Everything is transactional. It's on an individual basis for that particular transaction. Okay. Let me show you the pattern of these 2 dimensions across advanced economies. So here on the y-axis is employment stability from 0 to 100. So 0 is low employment stability, and you can see the US is right at the bottom. And you can see France is up at the top. Okay, and that is probably consistent with what you know about these countries. But notice Germany is also pretty high. All right, and then concentrated ownership is on the x-axis. Concentrated ownership in the US is very low. Right? Hundreds, if not thousands, of shareholders. Whereas in Germany and France, it's very high. It's those families, typically. And so what you see is there's a cluster of economies in the bottom left. The UK, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and the US. These are those liberal market economies. And in the upper right, are the coordinated market economies. Germany and Sweden and Austria, Japan. Okay, it's not perfect, but you see there's a tendency, right? There's a clear sort of grouping. Okay. And, Okay, so what are the implications for innovation? Well, in Germany, Labor and capital don't move around that fast, right? They tend to be relatively immobile. Workers are long-term in their jobs. Capital is lent by a bank through loans, and loans typically are long-term in comparison to going to the stock market. Right? In the US, they're short-term. Workers are laid off quickly in a downturn. And you go to the stock market to raise money, and that's also short-term. Okay, and so what are the innovation implications? What kind of innovation does Germany promote as a result of this long-term focus? Long-term incremental innovation. Because you need an environment that allows individual workers the security to invest in education that builds up their very specific skills and knowledge to that particular company they work for. And the only way you can be confident in getting that those highly specialized skills and knowledge is if you know you're not going to get laid off, right? And if you have an education and training system that is tailored for giving workers specialized skills and knowledge, such as apprenticeships, but ongoing education programs beyond that. And you need bank lending to allow the firm to think long-term in its financing. And you need corporate ownership, owners who are committed to the long-term success of a company, not the short-term quarterly earnings reports, which would then lead them to lay off workers if necessary. Okay, so that you can see then how the incentives of the market institutions produce a focus on incremental innovation in the German context. In the US, it's different. In the US, as I keep saying, if there's a problem economically, workers are the first to go. Right? And as a consequence, they don't have an incentive to cultivate skills and knowledge specific to the company they work for. They want general skills and knowledge that they can take with them to different companies, right? And the financing, as I said, is through the stock market. And as a consequence, if you're an entrepreneur in the US, you're investing in innovation, it's easier for you to get the workers you need because you can poach them from other companies. There's no collective agreement making it difficult to get the particular knowledge that these employees have and hiring them away, as in Germany. And it's easier to raise the money you need from the stock market. Because you need money quickly, you go to the stock market, you go to venture capitalists or you go to angel investors, but they have a mechanism to quickly exit their investment through the stock market. And thus that facilitates the ease of an entrepreneur raising money quickly. Okay. Are you with me? Okay, I'm going to test you on this in just a second. All right. So for example, some very famous companies, the most famous companies that you can think of in Germany and Japan are often the companies I have listed here on the left side, right? Like Daimler-Benz, Bosch, Siemens, Toyota, Komatsu, right? The most famous German and Japanese companies are these old, established, manufacturing-related companies typically, right? And their competitiveness is based on the ability to offer quality products. But American companies are not like that. The most well-known American companies, their competitive advantage comes from generating new ideas, radical new technologies, such as Uber and SpaceX and Google and Amazon, right? It's a natural outcome of these market arrangements differing between the two economies. Okay, now I'm going to test you, as I said. All right. Singapore and Hong Kong. So that's why so Singapore and Hong Kong. And these are jurisdictions. So I recognize Hong Kong is a part of China, but you can think of it as having a different structure to its market institutions, while it was under the administration of the UK. And so it has a different incentives from mainland China. And I'm going to get to mainland China in just a moment. So that's why I'm mentioning this now. Okay, so Singapore and Hong Kong. What kind of innovation do you think they're really good at? So we said LMEs are better at radical or disruptive innovation. CMEs are better at incremental innovation. What about Singapore and Hong Kong? Okay, well, there's 4 possibilities. They could be good at radical. They could be good at incremental. They could be good at neither. That's 3. Or they could be good at both. That's 4. Okay, so there's 4 possibilities. All right, how many say they're good at radical? They're good at disruptive innovation. Anybody? 1 person? Okay, you're brave, thank you. Okay, how about incremental? Who says they're really good at incremental innovation? Raise your hand. Don't worry, I'm not going to hold you to account. I just want to, help get a sense. Okay, all right, you can only vote once, by the way. Okay, all right. How many say they're good at neither type of innovation? Wow, okay. Okay, the Singaporean says that. Okay, good. Now you're not going to be angry with me. Well, okay, I just gave away the... So how many say they're good at both? Nobody says they're good at both. All right, okay, so let's take a look at the evidence. Okay, so here is the triadic patents per million population. And what this means, what triadic patents are patents for technologies that are the most important technologies because the companies file them in the EU, the United States, and Japan. So that means they're the most important technologies that companies are patenting when they do it on all 3, with all 3 patent offices. And it's per million population, so it takes into account the size of that country's, or that jurisdiction's population, okay? Because we need to account for that. And when you look at it this way, you can see Singapore and Hong Kong are at the bottom. Sorry. Yeah, they're right at the bottom, right? And that's what you would expect based on the logic of what I just presented to you. That's exactly what you would expect. Because in Singapore, who are the big owners of companies there? Government and also families, right? Both families and government, they're both concentrated owners, like Germany, right? But how about employees? Employment relations, are they stable or not? They are not stable. In fact, it's even easier to hire and fire workers in Singapore and Hong Kong than in the United States. And ownership is even more, well, in some measures, it's even more concentrated than Germany. So they're even more conflicting. They're very conflicting in their innovation incentives. And as a result, the more money they pour into producing disruptive innovation like Silicon Valley, the worse that this conflict becomes. The more ineffective their innovation system is, in fact. So that's the argument that elicited the call from Lee Kuan Yew's personal secretary. Right? It's not about culture, it's about the innovation incentives arising from the market institutions of their respective economies. And Hong Kong is similar, right? It's not government ownership in Hong Kong so much, it's about family ownership there, right? But it's also easy to hire and fire in Hong Kong. So they're conflicting, they're not complementing each other in terms of producing a long-term orientation or a short-term orientation. They're conflicting. Okay, all right, now, the big question you're probably all wondering is, what about China, right? Okay, what about China? Where is China, first of all? All right, so we're talking about China as a whole. China's big, obviously. So you might run into the problem of saying, well, Shanghai is not like Urumqi, for example. But when we talk about these market institutions, they're typically national level regulations. They apply to the whole country, right? So regulations governing corporate ownership, they're things that the whole country must abide by. It's not just one city, for example. Okay, so where is China? Just according to the two dimensions that we are looking at the other economies. So employment stability. In general, does China have a high level of employment stability or not? How many say it's high? Relatively high employment stability. Okay. How many say it's low? How many say, okay, that's interesting. Okay, and that probably reflects where you work. So if you work for a private company in Shanghai, employment stability is probably low, a little bit lower. But if you work for a state-owned company, it is certainly high, right? And if you work for a state-owned company outside of Shanghai, it's very, very high. Okay, I'll show you in just a moment where it is, but let me ask you now, corporate ownership. So corporate ownership, is it typically concentrated or is it very diffuse? Okay, concentrated. How many say concentrated, highly concentrated? How many say diffuse, like the US? Okay, all right, so so how many of you think China is here, where Hong Kong is? Anybody think it's like over in the bottom right here? Anybody? Over here, anybody think it's like the US? Anybody think it's up here? Okay, one person. Over here, by Germany and France, anybody? Okay, in the middle. Who says in the middle? Everybody says it's in the middle. Okay, all right. Okay, so let me show you now where China is. In fact, it's actually over here somewhere. Yeah, because the concentrated ownership is so high in China. Okay, but the very clear point is that China looks like a lot more like Germany than it looks like the United States. It is not like the US at all, according to the structure of its market institutions. That's clear. That's absolutely clear, right? I don't think there's any argument about this. And what does that mean for the type of innovation that thrives in that institutional context? Incremental innovation. And you might say, what about the star market in Shenzhen? Right? This is the next NASDAQ. Right? What about Silicon Valley down in Shenzhen? Right? Or other places? Isn't China trying to create the next Silicon Valley? Well, what does this tell you about the prospects for that? Is it likely to succeed or fail? I mean, the logic of it says it's probably going to fail. But it's scary to say that because there's so much happening right now, right? And you probably all are like, oh, I want to get in on that because it's exciting. Have any other countries in the world tried to create a NASDAQ? Do you know of any other countries that have looked at Silicon Valley and said, we want to do that? Russia? Yeah. Medvedev, right? Didn't he was sort of put in charge of trying to help make that happen. Anyone else? Any other countries? India? Okay, yeah. First of all, how did it go in Russia? Are they having a thriving NASDAQ lookalike? No. How about India? Is it a thriving NASDAQ-like market? I shouldn't say almost every, but most of the West European countries in the 90s especially, tried to create a NASDAQ. But they are like Germany. And in every case, it failed. Okay. So what, what does that tell you about, just based on the evidence of other countries trying to replicate Silicon Valley with a NASDAQ, what does that tell you about the likelihood of success for the star market? Well, you should observe. You should wait. Don't jump in now. Give it a few years. But in my opinion, it's going to be tough to make that work in the long run. Right now, it's succeeding because there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of speculative money going in. But over the long term, it's probably going to have difficulty succeeding. I can get into the reasons for that, but you can probably figure them out for yourselves based on what I've just told you. Okay, and now let me show you the comparison with triadic patents per million, and this is where you're all going to hate me. So China is way on the right side over here, right? And you're thinking, China is way more innovative than that. Come on, this is not right. And I agree with you. Why is this not a fair comparison? Why is it not fair to compare China with these other economies in this way? What's the problem? Oh, no, but it's per million. We're accounting for population, right? It's per million population, so we're accounting for population. But what's the other reason why this is a problem? Yes, GDP per capita, right. China is the only developing or emerging economy on this list. All the other economies here are advanced economies, high-income economies, right? So that's not fair. So what we should look at for China is the growth in these patents, right? That is a better indicator for how well China is innovating. Okay, so let's take a look. So this is patent applications to the European Patent Office, 2005 and 2012. I know this, you can barely even see this, so that's okay. It makes my point, and let me just tell you what my point is. So here's China, way over here. There are only 3 countries that have a higher rate of patent application growth than China between 2005 and 2012. And that's why there's so many countries here, and there's only 3 that are higher than China, right? And we're talking about the European Patent Office. And of course, China is basically on the other side of the world. So the only 3 that are higher are either part of or next to Europe. So they include Estonia, Poland, and Turkey. So that tells you China is doing something very right. China is doing something very right to be growing so rapidly. And the 3 economies here on the left, I've highlighted, or I have arrows to, are the 3 economies with the largest number of applications to the European Patent Office: Germany, Japan, and the United States. Okay, so I show you that, because this is 05 to 2012. Here's 2016. Here's China. Right? Now, US, Germany, Japan, they're still the top 3, but China is getting up there, and the change, So the number of patents here is 5,500 in 2012. In 2016, it's over 7,000. And in 2019, China is just behind the top 3. So China is doing phenomenally well in terms of the growth of its patent applications, its innovation potential, when you look at its growth rate. And that's the right way to look at emerging economies. So China's doing great. Okay, so now you like me, I hope. All right, maybe not. Okay, that's okay. You don't have to like me. All right, I'm just trying to provoke you. All right, so the basic point here is, what type of innovation do China's institutions encourage? What's the kind of innovation that China's institutions encourage? Incremental innovation. Okay. And that's Germany. It's not the US. But for China to really implement innovation like Germany, there's a secret to German innovation that makes it even better than other European countries. And if China wants to do it, they need to implement something similar. Do any of you know of the secret thing in German innovation that I'm referring to? It's hugely important to German innovation. Okay, I'll tell you in a moment. All right, so we're going to talk now, we're going to focus on this second one about funding sources. So we've characterized innovation according to market institutions, and now we're going to go down to the funding sources. This is where that German institution plays a big role. Okay, so in order for an entrepreneur to bring his or her idea to market, they have to cross this cash flow valley of death. They need to find people who are going to help them raise the money to bring their idea to make it a reality. And there are two specific gaps that they need help with. One is getting the money, and the second is the understanding or the information about what this idea can produce in reality, right? When you make it a prototype or when you bring it to market. So what is the technology? What is its potential? And what's the business opportunity of that technology? And entrepreneurs bridge these gaps differently in Germany and the US. And so the way they do it in Germany, this is the secret. It's an organization called Fraunhofer. Has anybody heard of Fraunhofer? Okay, only 1, 2, 3. See, I told you it's a secret. It's not a secret anymore. Okay, but this is the secret. This is what really makes German innovation special. Okay, so you have an idea, and typically that idea comes from universities or companies or the government. And then the people who are in charge of that idea will ask the Fraunhofer Institute, which the purpose of it is to engage in applied research. So the engineer or the scientist at that university or company or government will tell Fraunhofer, make us a prototype of this idea. And that's what Fraunhofer will do, basically. They will make that prototype. Once they make the prototype, they'll also create a business plan to help you think about how to bring it to market. And how do you bring it to market typically in Germany? It's not by getting angel investors or venture capital firms to help you raise money. It's about going to your bank. Bank lending is the key mechanism for generating the funding to expand the business, to make that prototype, that idea, into a market-seizing opportunity. Fraunhofer's budget is over 2.8 billion euros. Most of it comes from contract research from private companies, some of it from the federal government or the state government. Länder, it's state government. And just to give you, whoops, sorry, missed this slide. So it's the largest organization for applied research in Europe with 74 institutes and research facilities, over 28,000 staff, most of whom are scientists and engineers, right, and a budget of over 2.8 billion euros. So it's huge, which makes it amazing that it's a secret. So it's not, I'd call it a secret, but it's not a secret if you're German. Okay. So to give you a sense of how this works, here is the Fraunhofer Institute in the middle here. This is for the optical technologies innovation ecosystem in East Germany, in Jena. So this was created only in the past couple decades, because it was in around 1991 when East and West Germany merged. So it was after the merger of those countries that this was created. And this just shows you how coordination happens in reality. So you have private companies, you have public research organizations, and then you have universities and the Fraunhofer Institute in the middle connecting all of them together. And these lines represent scientists who are jointly on patent applications. And the darker lines indicate 2 or more scientists are on a patent application from 2 different organizations. So this is really showing the manifestation of coordination. That is what makes the German innovation ecosystem thrive. And the optical technologies ecosystem is just one of about 18 of these ecosystems that exist in Germany. Each one devoted to a particular type of technology. This is what really makes German innovation special. Let me just show you a short video of a lead scientist at this optical technology research institute in Jena. So we'll stop it at 3:07.
So my name is Andreas Tünnermann. I'm director of the Fraunhofer Institute of Applied Optics and Precision Engineering here in Jena, and I'm also chair for applied physics at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena. Jena is the major capital of optics in Germany, so roughly 150 companies are working in optical technologies here in this area, and there are also several university but also non-university research institutions addressing topics in optics. We are undertaking and promoting applied research, especially here in this institute, with a focus on optics and optical technologies. Our customers are, for example, small and medium-sized companies, but also global players. And we are focusing on solutions based on light to overcome the big challenges of the future. For example, in the field of energy, communication, but also, for example, in the field of production technology. One prominent topic is, in fact, the development of novel camera systems to make cameras, for example, very flat to be used, for example, in mobile communication systems. And a topic we are addressing in the moment is that we pick up principles from the insect eyes. So we are developing bio-inspired optical systems. So this is a one aperture approach. This is an objective which is bio-inspired by the human eye. So which is basically the solution which can be found in any traditional camera system of today technology. And here we have an objective which is bio-inspired by the insect eyes. So it's a multi-aperture approach. Both systems deliver similar resolution if they are attached to a CMOS sensor. And as you can see in the direct comparison of these two devices, you can reduce the total length of the objective, and of course, in the consequence, the thickness of your mobile phone by a factor of 5 or even 1 order of magnitude, depending on the resolution, using this multi-aperture approach in comparison to the one aperture approach. In nature, roughly 27 different eye solutions have been developed, And the insect eyes, they have been developed for low weight, low volume, and low brain capacity. So basically these are the optimum sensor optics to be used, for example, for mobile communication systems.
My name is Andreas Gebhardt, and I'm responsible for the ultra-precision manufacturing at our institute.
The video here.
And one of the main topics...
Oh, okay, I guess I just pressed this. Okay, so that was just to give you a sense of, optical technologies research in Germany in this Fraunhofer Institute. That's real. I mean, this is just to give you a sense of the reality of it. And to show you how this has amplified innovation in Germany among small and medium-sized companies, these Mittelstand firms, which is what Germany is famous for, right? With regard to innovation and manufacturing, you can see the different measures of innovation among these small, medium companies in Germany relative to these other West European economies. According to each of these measures, these small, medium German companies are more innovative than their other West European counterparts. And most of them also have this coordinated market economy structure, but they don't have the Fraunhofer Institute. So that Fraunhofer Institute amplifies the innovation because the small, medium-sized companies, they don't have the resources to do the innovation research in-house. They're too small. But collectively, they can pool their resources and ask the Fraunhofer Institute to do the innovation for them. And the way this works is Fraunhofer will keep any patents that arise from the development of this technology. So they can use that technology, that patent, in other companies' research. And the company, of course, they get the prototype. They get to bring that product to market. But this is how everybody collectively benefits through coordinating their R&D through the Fraunhofer Institute. Right, so it's an amazing system that Germany has by which they help these Mittelstand firms. And you can see as well that manufacturing as a share of GDP among these advanced economies, Germany is the largest in Europe, right? So Germany it's known as this manufacturing powerhouse globally. And so Fraunhofer is really at the center of it, but it builds on the market institutions. Okay, so just to summarize, innovation in Germany, it encourages incremental innovation, but through the Fraunhofer Institute, funding gets directed primarily to manufacturing-related technologies because that's the industry in which most of those small, medium-sized enterprises are located. And if you know anything about Mittelstand firms in Germany, they're very specialized, they're niche. And this is consistent with their need to maintain long-term competitive advantage because the more niche they are, the more that they can be sure that they will remain competitive in comparison to other firms. But they have to be small. But this is what generates the need for the Fraunhofer Institute. Okay. What about the US? What about the US? How does innovation in the US happen? Well, money for innovation in the US comes from industry or angel investors or the federal government. And over the long run, it's the federal government that has really played the important role in guiding the direction of innovation in the US. And the key, and you can see venture capitalists are actually, they play a small role because they tend to come in at the late stage. When it's the early stage, it's usually these other players, angel investors or the government or companies. And you can see that in the dot-com bubble period, venture capital did get involved in early stage, but after the bubble burst, they stepped back. So VCs come in later. They're late stage financiers of innovation. Okay, so who are the main government agencies that promote innovation in the US? Well, there's really two big ones. The Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services. And to give you a sense of just how influential their research has been, almost all the key technologies that go into the manufacture of your smartphone are due to the funding provided by the US Department of Defense. So that might make you a little bit worried about whether the NSA is eavesdropping on your communications. But you can see that the DoD is responsible for the funding of the creation of the internet, really, right? To expanding it and making it a publicly available resource. They were responsible for funding cellular communication, GPS, right? Locating where you are, microchips, touchscreen technology. That was the CIA and the NSF, right? But you can see how each of these individual technologies would be of importance for military-related applications. Cutting through the fog of battle, helping soldiers know how to navigate in a field of battle where they need to know who is their enemy and who is, their friend. You can see the relevance of these technologies for the military. And that was the motivation for their development. It took companies like Apple to see the commercial relevance, to bring them together and put them into a commercially viable product. And that's often what commercial companies do. They just take existing research, basic research, and find a way to bring it to market. They're not usually doing basic research. They're doing applied research typically, right? Elon Musk is famous for this, right? He just finds existing technologies and finds a novel way to put them together so it's commercially viable. Okay. So in the US, the way innovation happens is typically you have an idea. Sometimes your friends in their garage, for example, is how we like to think of Silicon Valley. But more often, it's money from angel investors or companies or the Small Business Innovation Research Fund of the government, SBIR, and they will give money or provide the funding necessary to create a prototype, right, and do some initial product development. And then, after that first stage, venture capital will come in. And venture capital then takes it to the next stage with a first round of financing and then maybe a second round of financing until eventually they exit through the public listing of the company on the stock market. And it's that very deep liquid stock market in the US that allows for a very large and thriving venture capital industry. In other words, it is at the root, it's about very strong minority shareholder protections in the United States that allow for venture capitalists to have the confidence they can sell their stake in a company to other risk-acceptant investors, individual investors. And those individual investors are willing to take a risky stake because they know their investment will be protected due to those strong minority shareholder laws. Okay, anyway, you'll have to take some of my classes to get into the deeper understanding of how all this matters and where it comes from. But I'm just giving you the connection directly to innovation here. Okay. So the point is, it's different. In Germany, it's Fraunhofer. In the US, it's angels, the government, and companies primarily. And then it's venture capital in the US. In Germany, it's bank lending. Okay, so US markets, the institutions encourage radical innovation, and they have multiple funding sources that produce innovations, especially in services, IT, and other high-tech areas, because they're especially relevant to going to war, just to put it simply, right? Because the DoD is funding a lot of these innovations. Right, so that's very much why you see the innovations in IT especially, because they're of relevance to going to war at the heart of it. Okay. All right, so Germany is incremental, the US is radical, and neither of them is better than the other. In fact, it is to our benefit that they both exist. Because what happens is you get a new automobile being manufactured, right? The creation of a car to replace the horse and buggy. And maybe Ford, they ramp up production through mass production, but then Daimler-Benz, BMW, they perfect that manufacturing ability. They take that idea from the United States and they put it into their system and they make it really good. They generate high quality products, right? But it's the US where the initial product emerges, and Germany and Japan then make it good, make it better over time. So these two innovation systems complement each other. So it's nice. They do compete. There are radical disruptive innovations that emerge in Germany, and there are incremental innovations in the US, but as a whole, they tend to complement one another. Neither is better than the other, they're just different. Okay. Now you have this knowledge. Now you have this understanding of how innovation ecosystems are different. What does that mean for you? How can you, as a manager, use this knowledge to enhance the innovation capability of your company? Let me give you an example from Samsung. Anybody work for Samsung? Nobody works for Samsung here? Nobody? Okay, you do. All right. So you can check to make sure that what I'm saying is correct. And you can give some detail if I'm missing it. Okay, so I want to talk about two types of acquisitions that Samsung initiated. One is of a German camera company, and the second is of many high-tech companies, mostly located in the United States. And they did these acquisitions in completely different ways, but they were both successful for the most part. Okay, so let me just talk briefly about the German one first. Okay, so Samsung Aerospace. And does it still exist, Samsung? Do you know if Samsung Aerospace still exists? Still a division of the company? Not anymore? Okay, all right. Well, anyway, this is back in the 90s. They acquired a German company called Rollei, a high-end German camera manufacturer. Why did this happen so successfully? So just briefly, a bit of background about Samsung Aerospace. They were looking for a night vision systems technology for their military, for flying planes in particular. And Korea did not have a camera manufacturing industry at the time. It was mostly Japan and German firms. So they went to Japan first and became an original equipment manufacturer for the Minolta camera company in '79. And they built up their manufacturing capability in that way to start. But over time, they moved up. They acquired more knowledge and skill so they could move up to mid-range camera quality manufacturing. And then eventually they acquired sufficient skill to move up to the high end and acquire Rollei. And Rollei is a high quality camera manufacturing company. Okay, so here are the sales of Samsung Aerospace cameras from '86 to '97. So in '87, Samsung Aerospace developed their first research center, and their first camera model was called the Winky. Okay. And then from '88 to '93, they developed cameras through licensing arrangements with Japanese companies, particularly Minolta. And then Rolei has Samsung manufacture its cameras on an OEM basis. But the thing is that Rolei is very concerned that Samsung adhere to its quality standards. And so it monitors closely how Samsung manufactures cameras. And in this way, Samsung learns and develops higher quality manufacturing capabilities. And notice that this is a fairly long relationship, right? They start in 86 with Japan, or in 87, and then they continue up for a decade until eventually Samsung acquires Rolei because Rolei ran into financial difficulties. And then what happened? And then an R&D center was created. Samsung created an R&D center in Germany, not in Korea, in Germany, because they recognized the importance of having that R&D center located in that innovation ecosystem of Germany. It's very difficult to replicate a whole ecosystem. Yeah, you can have a terrific R&D department. You can have the best scientists and engineers. But if you don't have the ecosystem to accompany that, then their innovation outcomes are not going to be as good as they would be if they were in the ecosystem. It's that ecosystem, that Fraunhofer ecosystem, that really makes this special. And that's what they recognized. Okay. Move forward to 2012. Samsung Electronics. It opens a global innovation center in Silicon Valley devoted to software, right? They want to create a smart, they want to develop a smart, Anyway, they want to enter this smart home technology area, and it means they have to acquire a lot of high-tech companies quickly. And here's a list, a partial list from 2012 to 2016, because when you're in software, when you're in high-tech, cutting-edge areas, you need to act quickly because soon those new technologies are going to be outdated as other new technologies come along and outcompete or displace them. And so that's what they did. So in this radical disruptive environment, the best strategy is to act quickly, acquire quickly, and quickly roll out your new product. And that stands in clear contrast to the German acquisition, which took a decade at least of developing relationships with the scientists and engineers. So two completely different ways of going about acquisitions in these two different types of innovation ecosystems, both generating successful outcomes. Both very different in their execution. So the basic point here is, depending on the type of innovation your company needs to be successful, you have to use a different type of acquisition strategy, depending on what it is, the innovation you need for your company. Okay, so we're just about done here. Let me just wrap up with some key takeaway points. The first one is you need to, first of all, understand the institutional ecosystem that your firm is located in. And if you understand it, it can enhance your firm's innovation capabilities. First, by helping you identify the type of innovation your firm should pursue, by working with the incentives of those institutions and not against them. In the context of China, generally that means you need to think carefully about whether you want to do disruptive types of innovation or incremental types of innovation, because the institutions of China are naturally incentivizing incremental innovation. That's just a fact. Okay, but if you have a short-term strategy, you just want to be in the business for like 3 years, yeah, maybe you can succeed in disruptive innovation. But if you're thinking long-term, over the next 10 years for your company, you should probably think incremental. Second, understanding these innovation ecosystems will help you develop a better acquisition strategy depending on the type of technology you want to acquire. As the Samsung case showed you, if it's an incremental type of innovation, usually this takes a long time because you need to acquire the skills and knowledge associated with that technology. Whereas if it's radical or disruptive, you need to act quickly, right? And roll it out quickly, bring it to market quickly. So it's different. Third is to help you understand whether the Chinese policymakers are implementing regulations or policies, subsidies, different kinds of incentives. Are they helping? Are they consistent with? Are they aligned with the innovation system of the economy? So I keep pointing to this, but it's just such an obvious example, this creation of the star market. I hope it works, but I am very doubtful that in 10 years it's going to be as successful as it seems to be at this moment. I think right now it's just doing well because of the speculative demand. But I think in 10 years, that speculation, the speculative fever will be gone, and then the real underlying problems will emerge. That's my guess. But maybe I'll be wrong. Okay. But these are the three basic takeaway points I want to share with you to understand how you can generate innovation for your company and be successful in the long term. And do it in a way that your competitors don't understand. To get insights like this about how to make you successful and more competitive than your competitors, you're going to have to come to CEIBS. Because you can see that these insights come from an understanding of foreign markets, of Germany, of the United States. And CEIBS is really designed to draw on the insights and knowledge and understanding of these foreign markets to help Chinese executives succeed. And I doubt you'll get the same kind of deep understanding and how to apply it to the China context in other business schools. Okay, that's my sales pitch. Thank you.